Welcome to Unbiased and on the Fence. I'm Shane. Thanks for joining me. Well, I got a kind of a long presentation, but I wanted to start it with sort of a disclaimer that I'm just reporting some connections I made. So I really, uh, I'm not trying to convince anybody of anything. This is more of my attempt to sort of create a think tank. So please feel free to comment below if you have anything to add to all this information. Um, and just to let you know where I'm coming from. Personally, my message is one of love, and I'm striving to be like the real, undistorted Jesus, and to fully tap into the Christ consciousness that I believe Jesus himself said that we would do. And I believe just about every positive message that has come from positive people, individuals along the years in history, has been distorted to some extent or another. These would include Jesus, Yahweh, Ra, um, all positive entities, and all misrepresented Jesus, his message of love and forgiveness, distorted and turned into a way of trying to just control people. Uh, Yahweh's role in some of the genetic manipulation he did for positive reasons uh, were turned around and then um, just turned into something completely different when we check our history out. And then, of course, Ra, the so-called sun god of Egypt. And uh, I believe his role was also manipulated and distorted, and or they, I should say, because of besides Jesus, these other two entities are actually groups. Um, Also, I want to mention that anyone that I reference here is, I'm not saying that I'm completely on board with whatever they teach and say, or that they'll even agree or be on board with what I'm saying. So it's just important to note that don't be turned off if I mention somebody that you typically don't believe in what they have to say or anything like that. I just believe they have information that may or may not be part of what I'm presenting here. Um, so I wanted to talk about the law of one. I believe it's important that we view the law of one as not a religion, but more of a like a law, like we would think of gravity or something along those lines, because there's a sort of self-balancing that occurs within the law of one whenever free will distortions are broken, and um, it's important to sort of understand how that works, I believe. Um, see if I had this ready to go here. Let me switch you to, I came up with this concept art here that might be difficult to follow at first, but um, the law of one, if you can kind of imagine that we're inside one of these globes here, uh, that there's sort of this fractal nature to this whole thing. Um, I've divided it up. I don't believe there's actually like this battery that you see here, but I believe this makes it easy to sort of explain the density levels and then how we're kind of locked in this section, this matrix section right here, with the barrier between the third and the fourth density. And so, yeah, I think it's important to understand that this is sort of an octave, the seven densities of an octave. This side would be negative, this side would be positive. Um, I think it would be helpful if you take a moment to view a few other videos. Particularly these two would be good to view. Um, Together, you're looking at about 10 minutes to view these two. But the What is God video, it's Jesus' parable of the fishes, and what is truth. And I believe checking these two videos out will be very helpful, because when you view God as water, it begins to be more clear that water's water, right? You got crystal clear water, you've got um, murky and moldy water and frozen and steam. And water can exist in many forms, but it's still water. And someone had left a comment yesterday, uh, sort of disturbed that I would say that, we're all of one thing. And it's just, I believe, your perspective on it, viewing water. You might be crystal clear water, but someone else might be murky or moldy water. So, yeah, that was sort of my reason for passing on this video here. But I'm glad they commented because that allowed me to know that I needed to clear that up in my presentation today. So everyone's working for the good, and I appreciate that comment. And it doesn't get under my skin. So when you all have constructive information to leave in the comments, I really appreciate that because it helps me to know how you're perceiving the information I give. And it was coming off, I guess, like I was trying to proselytize for the law of one, and it's not like that at all. The law of one for me has just been sort of a nexus, a connecting point to connect a lot of information that's not only already out there, but a few things that clarify some things that um, is really helpful. This video here is one that's trigger activation. This talks about the ninth wave, and it's got a link in it to the original video. But the ninth wave that started, and it was a unity wave that began. So that sort of falls in line with this whole we are one sort of concept, without meaning you're a murderer or something on the other side. But we're all made of water, so to speak, or we're all made up of God, like the point I was trying to get across. So when we look at this, if we can imagine this as being the one octave, the 7 different density levels, Ra is coming to us with information from the 6th density. And we're trying to sort of push this barrier up and open up this 4th, the whole planet, And but for right now, we're kind of stuck right here. But another way to look at it is electricity. You might have positively charged and negatively charged electricity, but it's all electricity. So just another sort of way to look at it. So let's see. Now the law of one was channeled through back in 81 from Ra, and it is the same Ra from Egypt, but just so you know, Ra is actually a group of one mind, or a social memory complex made up of our brothers and sisters from 6th density, like I was mentioning. They're like up here. And although they're more advanced than us, they don't consider themselves to be, objects to be worshipped, or they don't consider themselves to be gods, but they consider themselves to be our big brothers and sisters, basically. So, let's see. What I want to first do, that I think this concept art does nicely, is identify the players. Just so as I'm reading through here, you can understand where it's coming from, who it's talking about. And the Confederation, as you see over here, this would be the positively oriented, the ones I personally believe are responsible for at least some of the Mandela effect changes. I also believe the Alliance would be part of that same Confederation. Now, I actually found out about the Law of One hearing from David Willcock when I first started looking into it. And, they're all about the cosmic disclosure and ascension, of course. But for those who already know these guys, this all ties into what they were saying. And like I said, I found out about the Law of One through them. And I believe the alliance that they speak of is part of this confederation here, as well as Jesus, Buddha, the Ra group, and the Yahweh group. Then on the other side of things, we have The Orion group. Now these will be the negatives. This will be the elite, better known as the Illuminati, the cabal, the shadow government. People like Hitler, the Crusaders. Um, the law one mentions how Genghis Khan was actually one who was able to, um, just from service to self, I think you had to be like over 95% service to self to actually graduate up to the next level. So he was able to go up a level from being so self-centered, which is sort of amazing. It doesn't happen very often though. But besides all that, this is going to also cover CERN and some new leaked information from CERN. The UFOs, the Ark of the Covenant, the Annunakki, aliens, angels, demons, giants, men in black, and even soulless ones or robots that are indistinguishable from you and I, and they're living among us. So, let's first start with the alleged leaked document claiming that at the most recent Bilderberg meeting, someone, a representative of CERN, actually announced to the Bilderberg group that CERN received a message from God, a single word message from God. The word was Tekel, Tekel, Tekel. Now, so far I've only heard about this in one place, and that is my man Unirock. So you can actually go over, I'll leave a link to this video. This is sort of the trimmed down version of it, and where he broke the story. And like I said, special thanks to him for all of his work of doing the research and everything. He even missed one of his broadcasts because he was so busy researching all this. But so what does this Tekel mean? Well, you guys remember the story of the writing on the wall from Daniel. I believe it was chapter 5 or 6. But yeah, in Daniel, at the writing on the wall, this actually comes from the saying, can you read the writing on the wall? It comes from this story here. And that's where the word Tekel comes from, the word they supposedly got. And when we look at the story, basically King Belshazzar has this feast, right, with thousands of his lords, and they ordered the vessels that they had plundered from Jerusalem to be brought to the party so they can drink out of them. And they're all partying it up, drinking out of them, and this finger appears and writes on the wall. And to cut a long story short, no one can really interpret it, and they send for Daniel, and he comes and reads that it says, Mene Tekel Parson, and interprets them for the king. Mene, God has numbered your days, numbered the days of your kingdom, and brought it to an end. Tekel, you have been weighed and found wanting. And Perez, the kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. So, while I was actually leaving a comment on his page, I looked up the story, and I was really surprised because I think I found a Mandela effect right in the scriptures. I always remember it being these 3 words here in the scriptures. But when I looked it up, the first appearance of where this normally would have appeared, I found this word, a parson. Of course, I researched it, and it looks, of course, like any other Mandela effect, like it's always been there, and they explain that, that just means the same thing as that. This is a trimmed down version of it. So I'm like 90% sure of it. I'm not 100% sure, but I didn't remember a different word being in there. I thought it was just these 3 words. So the word we want to look at is Tekel, the word that CERN received, that they believe they received from God. You have been weighed and found wanting. Now they took this as, hey, our collider ain't big enough, we need to make a bigger one. But I don't know. I don't know. We'll have to come back to that one. So let me adjust a few things here. And pull this over here so you guys can follow along if you want. So looking in the raw material, I looked up all of the information on the Orion group. Now you notice over here, they're the negative side. All the negatives fall under the Orion group over here. They're the ones that distorted all the different messages of the Confederation over the years and the people of the Confederation. So you got the positive and the negative. I brought up the Orion category and just went down through it, and I was amazed at how many connections I was able to make between things that are going around now and that we know, and what it was saying in here. So of course Adolf Hitler, their main thing is to create an elite, right, and then work in enslaving the non-elite. And they're working towards creating an empire of the elite. But the problem facing them is that they face a great deal of random energy released by the concept of separation. This causes them to be vulnerable as the distortions amongst their own members are not harmonized. So I'd ask, what density, remember we got our levels here, is the Orion group. Like the Confederation, there are a few third density, a larger number of fourth density, and a similarly large number of fifth density, and very few sixth density entities comprising this organization. Now, this is perhaps a good number to see here. Their numbers are perhaps 1/10 hours at any point in the space-time continuum, as the problem of spiritual entropy causes them to experience constant disintegration of their social memory complexes. Their power is the same as ours. So now we're thinking of, angels getting cast out of heaven. We always thought that, 1/3 of them got cast down and 2/3, so there's twice as many. Now we see here that there's 10 times as many of them. But they're just as powerful. The law of one blinks neither at the light or the darkness, but is available for the service to others and service to self. And that's because it's all really part of the same construct, you see. And it makes sense once you start to look into this anymore. So the questioner asks, I'm trying to understand how it would be possible if you were in the Orion group and pointed towards self-service. How could you progress, say from the third to fourth? What learning would be necessary for that? It says, you will recall that we went into some detail as to how those not oriented towards seeking service for others nevertheless found and could use the gateway to intelligent infinity. This is true at all densities in our octave. The beings are harvested because they can see and enjoy the light love of the appropriate density. Those who have found this light love light without benefit of a desire for service, nevertheless, by the law of free will, have a right to the use of that light love for whatever purpose. Also, it may be inserted that there are systems of study which enable the seeker of separation to gain these gateways. Now, I've highlighted CERN here, because it sounds like their message came from intelligent infinity to me. And we'll have a little bit more of that come up here in a little bit. So, once again, the Orion group's objective is to enslave the unelite. And it's important to note that you see here it says locate certain mind, body, spirit complexes. That's just basically people here on Earth, which vibrate in resonance with their own vibrational complex. That means that you don't necessarily have to be an elite, but you could have the elite mindset, like maybe CEOs of smaller companies that maybe they're not in with the elite, but they still have that same sort of psychopathic mindset of do whatever it takes to make it to the top, the dog eat dog world people or whatever. And then there's the others that, if they're not in with the Orion vibration, they try to enslave them. So then there's the Crusaders. The Crusaders move in their chariots to conquer planetary mind-body-spirit social complexes before they reach the stage of achieving social memory. Now that's actually what we're working towards when we get to fourth density. Social memory is when there's basically no more secrets. We are all tapping into the intelligent infinity, so to speak. And, there's not people that's keeping secrets to try to get over on someone else. And that's why Ra and Yahweh were able to sort of work of one mind in their specific group. And like the Ra channelings were coming through. It sounds like it's from one person, but it's really from a group or a hive mindset. Now the Crusaders from Orion coming to this planet for mind control purposes. How do they do this? The answer is observing free will. Contact is made with those who call. And these become elite. The remainder of the planetary entities are enslaved by their own free will. They ask him to give any names of anybody that we know today, and he says, I'm desirous of being in non-violation of free will. So they're going to withhold that information. Now, but he does give this tip. Contemplation of the fruits of the actions of those entities whom you may observe enjoying the distortion towards power, the powerful, the elite. That's how you recognize them. In this way you can discern for yourself this information. So how do they pass on this information? Let's see. There are those mind-body-spirit complexes upon your plane who do exercises and perform disciplines in order to seek contact with sources of information and power, leading to the opening of the gate to intelligent infinity. So ask what type of information is passed on? Technical, just as some in the Confederation, in attempts to aid this planet in service to others, have provided what you would call technical information. This would be like information that was passed on to, like, for free energy and things like that, but ended up being taken away and by people of the elite, and now we're still having to pay for energy, but it wouldn't really be necessary if they had been allowed to share that information, and this would be a much different place. But of course the elite always steps in and nabs it up for the control and manipulation of others. Orion Crusaders came here in chariots. Can you describe the chariots? Now we're talking about spacecraft here. Orion craft is of one of the following. Firstly, the elongated ovoid, sort of like an egg shape, which is of a darker nature than silver, but which has a metallic appearance if seen in the light. In the absence of light, it appears to be red or fiery in some manner. Other craft include disc-shaped objects of a small nature, approximately 12 feet in measurement and diameter. And then the box-like shape, approximately 40 feet to a side. Now that sounds like the Borg, doesn't it? Okay, other craft can take on a desired shape through the use of thought control mechanisms. And this is pretty interesting, because this sounds like they could, if they wanted to appear and look like a cloud and still not be seen, they could. Or maybe even just stay invisible. Some are more able to use intelligent infinity than others, because they seldom share that information. This is pretty interesting. Is there any effort by the Confederation to stop the Orion chariots from arriving here? The answer is every effort is made to quarantine this planet. However, the network of guardians, much like any other pattern of patrols on whatever level, does not hinder each and every entity from penetrating quarantine. For if request is made in light love, the law of one will be met with acquiescence. If the request is not made due to the slipping through the net, then there is penetration of the net. How does the Confederation stop the Orion chariot from coming through the quarantine? Basically, an entity which is approaching is held in the name of the one Creator, and the entity thus held is bathed in love light and will of free will obey the quarantine due to the power of the law of one. What would happen if the entity did not obey the quarantine after being held? It would be equivalent to you not stopping upon walking into a solid brick wall. But it's impossible to break the law, so no attempt is ever made, and there's never a confrontation of this sort. The only beings who are able to penetrate the quarantine are those who discover windows of distortion in the space-time continuum surrounding your planet's energy fields. Through these windows they come. These windows are rare and unpredictable. They question them. Orion Crusaders, when they do get through the net, give both technical and non-technical information. What type of non-technical information do they give? And this is all done by, is it done by telepathic communication? In advanced groups, there are rituals and exercises given, just as the service to others. The philosophy concerns the service of manipulating others that they may experience service towards the other self. Thus, through this experience, become able to appreciate service to self. These entities thus would become oriented towards service to self, and in turn manipulate yet others so that they in turn might experience the service towards the other self. Now I put mind trip there because do you see, it's kind of difficult to follow this, but you can see how their selfishness, if it in turn causes the other people to become selfish and enslave people beneath them, or even just the fact that these are groups, so their self is a group and thus includes others, everything balances out in the end. If you really think about it, that's really crazy. But that is a difficult path. So is it possible for an entity here on Earth to be so confused as to call both the Confederation and the Orion group in an alternating way, one and the other? And this is pretty important. That's why you got to be really careful about trusting channelings and things like that, because they answer it is entirely possible for the untuned channel, as you call that service, to receive both positive and negative communications. If the entity at the base of its confusion is oriented towards service to others, the entity will begin to receive messages of doom. If the entity at the base of the complex of beingness is oriented towards service to self, the Crusaders, who in this case do not find it necessary to lie, will simply begin to give the philosophy they are here to give. Many of your so-called contacts among your people have been confused and self-destructive because the channels were oriented towards service to others, but in the desire for proof, were open to the lying information of the Crusaders, who then were able to neutralize the effectiveness of the channel. Now, I think this is really important to consider when you think about a lot of the Old Testament prophecies. Some of it was just riddled with a lot of messages of doom that to me just didn't sound like they came from a loving God. Saying I'll punish your family to the third and fourth generation and all that stuff. Now you can actually see how if this prophet who's proven himself once before comes out with these messages of doom and people start believing them, they can actually attract the messages of doom to actually happen. They start expecting it, and it leaves doorways open. Can you guys see what I'm saying here? Do you see why I feel like this information, although it seems like it's fringe or that it's coming from some kind of Egyptian god or something, this sounds like good information that needs to get out there, because at the heart of it, this message doesn't sound like it's self-serving to the one Ra that's giving it. This message sounds like something that we should all take to heart, and that really is a confirmation. That's why I've never even wanted to participate in any sort of channelings or anything, because you just never know what you're channeling, you're tapping into. You never know if one message is good, but maybe the next one is bad. And I think that's a good sign of it right there. If there's messages of doom somebody's predicting, they might have been getting something from the other side, from the negative side. Okay. Okay. They ask if the Crusaders are mainly fourth density. The majority is that's correct. Confederation or Orion individuals. Are there any of them walking among us? This is a pretty good one. No entities of either group walking among you at this time. Now, keep in mind this is 1981, so things might have changed. Just something to consider. But Orion uses two types of entities. The first type is a thought form, and the second kind is a robot. He's asked to describe the robot. The robot may look like any other being. So, this is crazy. It doesn't say any other human being either. That means there might be a wild dog or something roaming down the street, and you're just thinking it's a wild dog or dog got loose, and it could really be a robot from the Orion group. I don't know, spying or something. I really don't know, but he's asked who are the men in black. They're the thought form type. Now, I've often heard of, people's out trying to look in Area 51, and suddenly these men in black appear in the sedan, and they didn't see them drive up or anything, and then they're completely clean with no dust on their car. Have you guys heard any stories like this? And you think, I didn't even really believe them. I thought, oh, that's pretty clever for them to come up with that. But this makes that all make a lot of sense now. The thought form type of entity. Now, even though they're a thought form, they have certain physical characteristics. Their true vibrational nature is without third density vibrational characteristics, but they're able to materialize and dematerialize when necessary. And then they're asked if the men in black are used by the Orion Crusaders, and they confirm yes they are. So we're asked, let's see, he asked this question: if the Confederation landed on Earth, they would be taken as gods, breaking the law of free will and thus reducing their polarization towards service to all. So back to the battery here. If one of these sides breaks the law, it sort of causes the short circuit, and what would have normally, without this occurring, would have made one side gain unfairly, it causes a loss of polarization. So just like sort of a battery, when you short it out, it loses some of its power, you know what I mean? I assume that the same thing would happen if the Orion group landed. How would this affect their polarization towards service to self if they were able to land and they became known as gods? In the event of a mass landing of the Orion group, the effect of polarization would be strongly towards an increase in the service to self, precisely the opposite of the former opportunity which you mentioned. So then these ask, is it better for them to sort of work behind the scenes and get recruits from people from this planet, going for the service to self strictly on their own use of free will, or is it just as good for them to make this landing, mass landing, and demonstrate their remarkable powers and get people that way? Now this is why I wanted to bring up Stephen Greer, because he's been talking about this planned false flag alien invasion, that to like, I don't know, freak people out or something. But this right here lets you know that if you do see some sort of alien invasion, it most likely is a false flag done by our own people because of this right here. I mean, we know if you read in other parts of the raw material, back in 81, we already had craft back then. And I plan on talking about that in another video, more on the UFO topic. But just so you know that we did have craft back then. And yeah, so here you can see in the first instance, if they were to sort of work behind the scenes, that would be more beneficial for them because it does not infringe upon the free will. Now, in the second circumstance where they just sort of come down, display their powers, and it would create a loss of polarization due to infringement, because see, they're not allowed to do that. They're not allowed to reveal themselves that way. That's cheating, so to speak. But it's a natural law. The law of one is a natural thing. It would just naturally hurt them, just like jumping out a window, you naturally fall. But you can see here it would be a gamble, because if the planet then were conquered and became part of the empire, the free will would then be reestablished. So it's sort of like jumping out a window and you take a chance on maybe landing on something and you survive and it just ends up working out. So something to think about. Because let's see, desire to progress inhibits the group from breaking the law of confusion. And that's, they would be revealing themselves and breaking that law of confusion. You mentioned the word empire in relationship to the Orion group. I have thought for some time that the movie Star Wars was somehow an allegory, in part, for what is actually happening. Is this correct? Ra answers that this is correct, in the same way that a simple children's story is an allegory for physical, philosophical, social, complex distortion understandings. That's pretty interesting there. So it almost makes you realize why the Mandela effect changed to Star Wars with Luke, I'm your father, that I spoke about in the narrative that I believe the Mandela effect is showing us. That was just a few videos back. You can watch that if you want. Okay. Now, we're going to get into the Yahweh stuff that's real interesting. Can you name the entity that was sent 3,600 years ago? He was Yahweh. Can you tell me what the Orion group did in order to try to cause its downfall? The technique was that of building upon other negatively oriented information. This information has been given by the one whom your people called Yahweh. This information involved strictures, or that's like restrictions, on the behavior for promises of power of the third density, service to self nature. These two types of distortions were impressed upon those already oriented to think these thought forms. This eventually led to many challenges of the entity known as Jesus. I've talked about this before, the way Judas was mistaken, thinking that if Jesus was pushed into a corner, like he was just before they took him and crucified him, that he would, go into his glory and rule over people. But Jesus was never, Jesus' plan was never to come and rule as a king over people. And that's another distortion of the church, because Jesus was oriented towards love and service to others, as you can see by his life he demonstrated. So they're asked how Yahweh communicated to Earth's people. Now, the first communication was what you would call genetic. The second communication was the walking among your people to produce further genetic changes in consciousness. The third was a series of dialogues with chosen channels, and that's where we get into Ezekiel and some of the other prophets that we read. So you ask what genetic changes. And it was a cloning process. Entities incarnated in the image of Yahweh entities. Sound like familiar from the book of Genesis? Let's create man in our image. The second was a contact of the nature as sexual, changing the mind, body, spirit complex through natural means of the patterns of reproduction devised by the intelligent energy of your physical complex. Now, of course, depending on what religion, for those people, we got the whole Judaism and we've got the whole um, Islam, and they all trace back. When you read the Bible and you read the Quran, they both trace back to Abraham. And you got Abraham to Isaac for Judaism, and you got Abraham to Ishmael for Islam. And one of them were actually the offspring of one of the Yahweh group. Now, I'm not going to speculate which was which. Um, to me, it sounds like the Jewish was and if you think about the story itself, it seems like the Jewish one, because he jumped the gun and uh, got with Hagar, and so Ishmael was really truly the firstborn, but he didn't wait and trust God, and then Isaac was born later. So, uh, so let me continue on here. 75,000 years ago, as you measure time, the changes subsequent to that time were one of one purpose only, that to express in the mind-body complex those characteristics which would lead to further and more speedy development of the spiritual complex. So they first made some changes 75,000 years ago, and they're going to go over that again, so I won't tell you about it. When did Yahweh act to perform the genetic changes that Yahweh performed? The Yahweh group worked with those of the planet you call Mars 75,000 years ago in what you would call the cloning process. There are differences, but they lie in the future of your time-space continuum, and we cannot break the free will law of confusion. Are you hearing this? It lies in our future, and we know it hasn't happened since 81. So something in our future is going to involve the work they did 75,000 years ago. And I have a feeling it might be giants, but I'm just speculating. The second time, 3,600 approximately years ago, the time of attempts by those of the Orion group during this cultural complex, this was a series of encounters in which the one called Anak were impregnated with a new genetic coding by your physical complex means so that the organisms would be larger and stronger. Sounds like giants. Yes, why did they want larger and stronger organisms? The ones of Yahweh were attempting to create an understanding of the law of one by creating mind-body complexes capable of grasping the law of one. So it was intended for good reasons at first, not really for mining like the story goes here on, when you look up history, it sounds like that was the purpose of it. But the experiment was a decided failure from the view of the desired distortions due to the fact that rather than assimilating the law of one, it was a great temptation to consider the so-called social complex or sub-complex as elite or different and better than the other selves. This one technique of service to self. The entities of Yahweh were responsible for this procedure in isolated cases as experiments in combating the Orion group. However, the Orion group were able to use this distortion of mind-body complex to inculcate the thoughts of the elite rather than concentrations upon the learning teaching of oneness. Yahweh was of the Confederation but was mistaken in its attempts to aid. Then Yahweh's communications did not help or did not create what Yahweh wished for them to create. Is this correct? Well, the results were mixed, where the entities embraced oneness. The manipulations of Yahweh were very useful, but wherein the entities of free will had chosen a less positively oriented configuration, the Orion group were able for the first time to make serious inroads upon the consciousness of the planetary complex. So, 3,600 years in the past, there was an influx of those of the Orion group, Due to the increasing negative influence upon thinking and acting, they were able to begin working with those whose impression from olden times was that they were special and different. An entity of the Confederation many, many thousands of years in the past, the one you may call Yahweh, had by genetic cloning set up these particular biases among these people who had come gradually to dwell in the vicinity of Egypt, as well as in many, many other places, by dispersion. Here the Orion group found fertile soil in which to plant the seeds of negativity, those of the elite who manipulate or enslave others. Yahweh felt a great responsibility to these entities. However, the Orion group had been able to impress upon the peoples the name of Yahweh as the one responsible for the elitism. So Yahweh then was able to take stock of the vibratory patterns, which is just talking about having to not go by his name Yahweh, or by their name Yahweh anymore, because it had been given a bad name. So in this complex, the old Yahweh, now unnamed, but meaning he comes. That sounds like from heaven they come or something, the Annunakki, what that translates from. That's a really close comparison to that. I'm just speculating, but okay. So were both the Orion and Yahweh philosophies impressed telepathically, or were there other techniques used? There were two other techniques used, one by the entity no longer called Yahweh, who still felt that if it could raise up entities which were superior to the negative forces, that these superior entities could spread the law of one. Thus this entity, and this is this new name, I guess, Yad Heshin Vahe, came among your people in form according to incarnate being and mated in the normal reproductive manner of your physical complex, thus birthing a generation of much larger beings, these being called Anak. Now I believe that was just going over that same information that we'd heard before. Really interesting. I'd like to get maybe Rex Bear or Matthew LaCroix to comment on this, because I know they both have a lot more information. And there's many others too about the Anunnaki and whatever. But okay, so what was the Ark of the Covenant, and what was its use? The Ark of the Covenant was that place wherein those things most holy, according to the understanding of the one called Moses, that's Moses, placed. The article placed therein has been called by your peoples 2 tablets called the 10 Commandments. There were not 2 tablets, there was one writing and scroll. This was placed along with the most carefully written accounts of various entities of their beliefs concerning the creation by the one Creator. This ark was designed to constitute the place wherein the priest, as you call those distorted towards the desire to serve their brothers, could draw their power and feel the presence of the one Creator. However, it is to be noted that this entire arrangement was designed not by the one known to the Confederation as Yahweh, but rather was designed by negative entities preferring this method of creating an elite called the Sons of Levi. Now, tell me that is an interesting parallel. Crazy. So, wow. A lot of interesting information there, a lot to take in. If you would, take time to see what you think of that and see what you can add to the comments below. I do appreciate you sticking with me this whole time. I know there was a lot of information, but whenever you break up this information, people don't see part of it in the other, so I'd rather it just all be together. That way it's not like somebody's coming in halfway through some kind of seminar or presentation and missing half of everything and then having to direct them back to it anyway. But do check out the videos I pointed out in the beginning. I think They will also help with this perspective. And let me know if you have something to add to this, because I really find this very, very informative, and it doesn't seem like they're sort of pushing their own agenda. In fact, they kind of are seem to be standoffish as it comes to saying too much, especially if it's something from our future. So we had some of the insinuating that there's these larger beings that we might encounter in our future. I don't know. What do you guys think of that? I do appreciate you watching. Please like and subscribe, and I'll see you on the next one. Thank you.